Chapter 35. The Kingsguard attacked in a steady, professional manner. The girls maintained a neat line, defending themselves and each other as they advanced. Their superior armour and weapons, along with their hugely superior numbers, meant that Duncan's small force of 35 boys were retreating steadily, giving ground constantly and struggling to stay alive. They were running out of space in which to retreat as they edged closer to one of the camp's walls. Behind the Kingsguard, who were several lines deep, Duncan could see a goblin in gold armour, which had to be Umkra. Beside him stood another goblin, one Duncan recognised all too well. Pelkar watched as the Kingsguard bore down on Duncan and his friends. The slow advance of the fearsome girls made it seem like they were being toyed with, but this wasn't a game. From the corner of his eye, Duncan saw one of his companions, whom he had freed along with Ben, fall to the finely made sword of the attackers whose gleaming armour became spattered by his blood. This was definitely not playing, and Duncan knew then that it was hopeless, that he was going to die any moment. Suddenly Pelkar gave an order, as if one of the retreating boys being killed was the trigger he had been waiting for. It must have been an order to halt, for every member of the Kingsguard stopped their advance and took a single step back, their weapons held ready. Duncan was left feeling exhausted and full of despair, yet glad of the break. Even Ben seemed glad to have a moment to catch his breath. Pelkar left the king's side and moved forward, but the strong force of the Kingsguard did not move. Instead, two of them lifted the mage goblin so he was raised above the deadly wall of female teenage soldiers. He called out to them, his robes billowing slightly in a gust of wind.
"What is going on here? All of you boys, lay down your weapons right now."
He watched closely as none of them made any move. It had been a test to see if they were still controlled by his dark magic. Surprisingly, Roptek leapt up atop Ben's shoulder once more, to make himself visible.
"They are following my orders,"
he announced boldly. The one-armed goblin was making a last-ditch attempt to save them, Duncan realised, and he knew it was likely to be their only chance of surviving the day.
"They have clear instructions to obey only me,"
he lied.
And how, please tell, did you achieve that?"
asked Pelkar. Since he had created the magic that enslaved the boys, he knew very well that it was not intended to work that way.
"Simple,"
said Roptek defiantly.
"I told them that I am the last true goblin, that the rest of you are clones, like the cloned boys that replaced them in their own worlds."
It was quick thinking by Roptek, as he bravely sought to find a way to protect the boys who had convinced him to betray his own kind.
"Very clever,"
conceded Pelkar, his croaking voice sounding genuinely impressed.
"Order them to submit to me, else I'll have them all killed,"
said the mage goblin, without a hint of emotion. He might as well have been talking about pot plants. Roptek glumly gave his final orders to the boys.
"I lied to you. All goblins are real, and you must obey them. Sheathe your weapons."
Duncan did so immediately, and the rest of the boys did so too, thankfully all realising that there was a small chance that they could get out of this alive and still free, at a cost of allowing Roptek to sacrifice himself. In that moment, Duncan promised himself that if he did get out of this alive, he would not stop until Pelkar and Umkra were brought down, and the humans and goblins alike were free of Umkra's oppression. With the threat seemingly dealt with, the Goblin King began to approach. He sat upon a throne carried by 8 of the Kingsguard. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he said,
"Traitor, who are you, and what did you hope to achieve here?"
Roptek spoke as proudly as he ever had.
"I am Roptek of the Wolf River clan, and I planned to build myself an army to kill you and make myself king."
The simplicity of the lie made it believable. Umkra, his voice somehow very commanding despite still having that screeching goblin sound, said,
"You have failed, and that failure will cost you many things, including your life. First, though, I think I will take your remaining arm."
The king pointed towards a pair of his guard.
"Take him away. I will deal with him later, personally."
The 2 Kingsguard moved forward to flank Roptek, before grabbing him roughly and carrying him away. Duncan's heart sank as he watched the brave goblin taken to a terrifying fate. He had done it to give them a slim chance of escape. Duncan and every boy with him would have to convincingly pretend to be under the spell of the goblins, obeying every word instantly until they had a chance to flee. Duncan heard a sniffle behind him somewhere, and realised that at least one boy was crying. Whether it was the sight of Roptek being taken away, or the thought of living as slaves to the goblins once more, it didn't matter. Both things were worthy of a few tears.
"Stand to attention!"
snapped Pelkar. The Kingsguard unanimously stood up straight, feet together. Duncan did too, as did most of those with him. But at least one boy was not fast enough, and it caught Pelkar's attention. He looked at the boys suspiciously, studying each of them in turn, searching for something, anything. Then the distasteful mage goblin snapped another order, to lay down on the ground. This time all of the boys were ready and obeyed instantly. All of the Kingsguard present were also obliged to obey, but Pelkar ignored them, watching the boys intently. Almost as soon as the humans were on the ground, Pelkar ordered them to get up and start hopping. They all did it as fast as they could.
"What's this about, Pelkar?"
asked an unamused Umkar from his throne, perplexed by the instructions being given by his favoured mage goblin.
"Something about these boys doesn't feel right. I fear that Roptek may have done more than he admits to them,"
explained Pelkar. Umkar sounded impatient as he said,
"This inspection of the training camp can be postponed until you get your affairs in order, Pelkar. Decide quickly if the boys are of use, else have them killed. I care not."
The mage goblin thought about how best to make a decision about the boys. Then he pointed to the closest two of them, ordering them to stand before him. Careful to obey every order instantly, the closest two boys, Sam and Finn, moved forward to stand in front of Pelkar. Pointing at Finn, he snapped,
"Kneel."
Finn dropped to his knees. Then the robed goblin looked at Sam and said,
"Draw your sword."
Sam did so, but shot Duncan the tiniest glance as they both filled with dread at what was about to happen. As soon as Pelkar screeched the next words at Sam, Duncan knew what was coming.
"Kill him,"
came the feared words as he pointed hatefully at Finn. Sam obediently raised his blade high and brought it down with all the speed and force he could, straight toward the tiny mage goblin. The devious mage goblin must have suspected such an action, for he was ready and danced back nimbly as he used his magic to make Sam's blade swerve out of his control. The blade very nearly did hit Finn, who still knelt with his eyes closed, expecting his death. Duncan knew their hopes of slipping away unnoticed had gone. It seemed that they were back to their first plan, of dying free, as Pelkar darted forward again, this time with a small knife gripped in his hand. It might have been small, but the knife was delivered with precision, as Pelkar drove it straight into Sam's chest and through his heart. Sam dropped to the ground, his life gone. Duncan also dropped to the ground, filled with grief, and a sorrowful gasp was released from many of the boys behind Duncan. He had barely known Sam for a week, but in that short time they had become firm friends, and had risked their lives for each other. To see his lifeless body slumped on the ground was causing a storm of rage that swirled around the sadness of the loss, engulfing it. As Sam had dropped, Pelkar had leapt onto Finn's back and held the knife across his neck, ready to deliver another murderous cut as he watched the rest of them to gauge their reaction. Nobody moved. The boys remained frozen, full of concern for Finn. The Kingsguard were immobile, awaiting orders. Pelkar watched, intrigued.
"There is something I'm missing, isn't there?"
he hissed at them.
"Roptek was not in control, was he? How is it that you are free of my magic?"
he demanded. Duncan almost felt several of the boys glance at him, causing Pelkar's gaze to zero in on him.
"Tell me now, or this boy dies."
The unemotional words were said by the mage goblin. Duncan decided that the time for hiding and secrecy was over. With his hands on the ground, he used his own magic and drew a sandsword as he stood. Pelkar's eyes widened at the sight of the magical weapon in Duncan's hand.
"Move and he dies,"
screamed Pelkar, pressing his knife tighter against Finn's throat, as he sounded less sure that he was in control. Unsure quite what to do, they stared at each other for a moment. That moment was broken by the most unexpected thing. A dragon seemed to appear in the sky. At least the shadowy shape of a very large winged beast flew towards them with the sun behind it, and from it came a huge fireball that shot towards them and exploded amongst the Kingsguard, scattering them.